When a battle-scarred hyena dragged an abandoned lion cub to safety, no one could have predicted the extraordinary bond that would change everything. What happened next defied every law of nature and left an entire community in tears. In the sprawling acacia grasslands of Botswana's Kagalagadi region, where red sand stretches endlessly toward purple sunsets, Marcus Mac Thompson had built a life as weathered and enduring as the baobab trees that dotted his property. At 58, Mac's weathered hands bore the calluses of a man who had known both warfare and wilderness in equal measure. His left shoulder carried shrapnel scars from his 3 tours in Afghanistan, where he had served as a combat medic with the British Army, but his eyes still held the steady gaze of someone who had learned to find hope in the darkest places. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Mac hadn't always lived in the African bush. For 15 years after his military service, he had worked as a paramedic in Manchester, saving lives on city streets that felt nothing like the desert landscapes where he had learned what it truly meant to heal. But after his wife Catherine died in a car accident 4 years ago, the gray English skies had felt suffocating. Their dream had always been to retire to Africa, to run a small wildlife rehabilitation center where they could give back to the natural world that had always called to them. When grief threatened to consume him, Mac had honored that dream alone. Now he operated the Kagalagadi Wildlife Haven, a modest rehabilitation facility on 40 acres of leased land adjacent to the massive Kagalagadi Transfrontier Park. The facility was small but respected, taking in injured antelope, orphaned meerkats, and the occasional leopard that had wandered too close to human settlements. Mac worked alongside 3 local staff members, but the isolation of the location meant that for weeks at a time, it was just him and the animals, finding solace in their simple needs and honest trust. The December heat was brutal that year, with temperatures soaring above 40 degrees Celsius and no rain for 3 months. The drought had pushed wildlife into desperate situations, forcing predators closer to human settlements and creating conflicts that often ended badly for both animals and people. Mac had seen more injured animals in the past month than in the previous 6 combined. Lions were venturing far from their usual territories, following the dwindling herds of antelope toward water sources that were rapidly disappearing. Mac's daily routine had become a careful balance of conservation work and survival. Each morning before dawn, he would check the rehabilitation enclosures, ensuring the animals had enough water and that the solar-powered cooling systems were functioning. His facility housed a growing number of animals, 2 young cheetahs whose mother had been killed by ranchers, an elderly baboon with a broken leg, several ground squirrels recovering from vehicle strikes, and most recently, a young female hyena named Casey. Casey had arrived 3 weeks earlier, brought in by park rangers who had found her caught in a poacher's wire snare. The trap had cut deep into her front leg, and infection had set in before she was discovered. Mac had worked for hours cleaning the wound, fighting to save not just her leg but her life. Hyenas were among the most misunderstood animals in Africa, vilified in popular culture but actually intelligent, social creatures with complex family structures. Casey was no exception. Despite her pain and fear, she had shown remarkable intelligence, quickly learning Mac's routines and even seeming to understand when he was trying to help her. What made Casey's situation more heartbreaking was that she had clearly been part of a clan. Hyenas were rarely solitary by choice, and her distressed calls during her first nights at the facility had been answered by distant howls from the darkness beyond the fence. But as days passed and her clan failed to find her, those answering calls had grown fainter and eventually stopped altogether. Mac knew that injured hyenas were often abandoned by their clans if they couldn't keep up, a harsh but necessary survival strategy in the unforgiving wilderness. The loneliness in Casey's dark eyes reminded Mac too much of his own grief. Both of them were survivors, cut off from the families they had known, learning to navigate a world that suddenly felt foreign and dangerous. Catherine had always said that Mac had a gift for seeing the soul behind the scars, whether in wounded soldiers or injured animals. Now, watching Casey pace her enclosure with her distinctive limping gait, he recognized a kindred spirit struggling with isolation and loss. Mac's nearest neighbor was Dr. Sarah Naledi, a wildlife veterinarian whose small clinic was 15 kilometers away. She visited weekly to check on the more serious cases and had become Mac's closest friend in this remote corner of the world. Their son David lived in Gaborone, the capital, working as a teacher and visiting monthly when the roads permitted. But most days, it was just Mac and his patients, finding healing in each other's quiet company. The radio crackled with reports of increasing human-wildlife conflict as the drought intensified. Ranchers were losing livestock to desperate predators, and retaliatory killings were becoming more common. The park authorities were overwhelmed, trying to manage both conservation and the growing tensions with local communities who depended on their cattle for survival. As Max stood on his porch each evening watching the sun set over the endless grassland, he felt the weight of responsibility for the creatures in his care. Each animal represented a small victory against the forces that were pushing Africa's wildlife toward extinction. But he also felt the deep ache of solitude that came with this calling, the knowledge that his work mattered but that he was doing it largely alone. The morning that would change everything began like countless others, with Mac rising before dawn to the sound of Hadada ibis calling across the grassland. The thermometer already read 32 degrees, promising another scorching day that would test both animals and equipment. As he pulled on his khaki work shirt and boots, Mac noticed unusual sounds coming from Casey's enclosure, not her typical morning vocalizations, but something softer, almost nurturing. Mac grabbed his medical bag and water bottle, following his established routine of checking each animal before the heat became unbearable. The cheetah cubs were sprawled in whatever shade they could find, panting despite the early hour. The baboon sat quietly in the corner of his enclosure, favoring his healing leg but alert to Mac's presence. Everything seemed normal until he approached Kesey's rehabilitation area. What he saw stopped him cold. Through the mesh fencing, Mac could see Kesey lying in an unusual position, her body curved protectively around something small and golden. At first, his mind struggled to process what he was witnessing. Hyenas were carnivores, opportunistic hunters who would typically view a small animal as prey, not something to shelter and protect. Moving closer with deliberate caution, Mac felt his breath catch in his throat. Nestled against Kesey's injured leg was a lion cub, no more than 8 weeks old, thin and clearly dehydrated but alive. The cub's ribs were visible through its spotted golden coat, and its eyes held the dull look of an animal that had been alone too long. Most shocking of all, Kesey was gently licking the cub's matted fur, cleaning it with the same tender care a mother would show her own offspring. Mac's mind raced through possibilities. Lion cubs didn't simply wander into rehabilitation facilities. This youngster had to have come from somewhere, but the nearest Pride territory was at least 20 kilometers away. How had it survived the journey? More importantly, how had it ended up in Kesey's enclosure, and why hadn't she killed it? The answer came as Max circled the enclosure, looking for signs of how the cub had entered. Near the back corner, he found a section of fencing that had been dug under, the earth scraped away by determined claws. The tunnel was too small for an adult lion, but perfectly sized for a hyena with a specific mission. Kesey's injured leg showed fresh scrapes and dirt, evidence of recent digging despite her disability. The realization hit Mac like a physical blow. Kesey hadn't found this cub by accident. She had somehow located it in the wilderness and, despite her own injuries, had brought it back to the only place she knew offered safety, her enclosure at the rehabilitation center. The injured hyena had kidnapped the abandoned lion cub, but not for the reasons nature documentaries would suggest. She had saved it. Mac had spent decades working with animals, first as a military dog handler in Afghanistan and later in wildlife rehabilitation, but he had never witnessed anything like this. Hyenas and lions were supposed to be mortal enemies, competing for the same resources, engaging in brutal territorial disputes that often ended in death. Yet here was Kesey, a creature that should have viewed the cub as either threat or food, instead treating it like her own young. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his radio to call Dr. Naledi. This situation was beyond his experience, potentially dangerous, and certainly unprecedented. But as he raised the device to speak, he paused. The nearest wildlife authorities were 3 hours away on good roads. In this heat, with the cub already dehydrated, that might be too long to wait for official intervention. Kesey lifted her head as Mac approached the enclosure gate, her dark eyes meeting his with an expression he had never seen before. It wasn't the wary submission of a patient animal, or the grateful trust he had earned through weeks of care. This was something deeper, a mother's fierce protectiveness mixed with desperate hope. She seemed to be asking him to understand, to see what she saw in this unlikely situation. The cub stirred against Kesey's warmth, making soft mewing sounds that should have triggered every predatory instinct the hyena possessed. Instead, Kisi shifted position carefully, ensuring the youngster remained comfortable while keeping herself between the cub and any perceived threat, including Mac himself. Decision time had arrived. Mac could call the authorities, document this extraordinary behavior, and let others determine the fate of both animals. The safe choice, the expected choice, the choice that wouldn't put his facility's reputation at risk. Or he could trust his instincts, the same intuition that had helped him save lives in combat zones and emergency rooms, and see where this impossible situation might lead. Max set down the radio and opened his medical bag instead. If he was going to help, the cub needed immediate attention. Dehydration could kill within hours in this heat, and the youngster's condition suggested it had been alone for days. Whatever had happened to its pride, whatever series of events had led to this moment, the immediate priority was keeping both animals alive. Kisi watched intently as Mac prepared a small syringe with electrolyte solution. When he approached the fence, she didn't growl or retreat. Instead, she seemed to understand that this human, who had already proven trustworthy through weeks of medical care, might be the key to saving the small life she had risked everything to protect. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the enclosure, where two species that should have been enemies had instead found an impossible bond. Mac knelt by the fence, knowing that his next actions would determine not just the survival of two remarkable animals, but the direction of his own life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Getting the electrolyte solution into the cub proved more complex than Mac had anticipated. Working through the fence mesh while Kisi watched his every movement required patience and precision. The hyena remained protectively close, occasionally sniffing Mac's hands through the wire but never showing aggression. Her behavior defied everything he thought he knew about these misunderstood predators. The cub, which Mac decided to call Tao after the lion constellation, was weaker than he had initially realized. As Mac carefully administered small amounts of fluid, he could feel how dehydrated the young animal had become. Tao's tongue was dry, his gums pale, and his breathing shallow. Without immediate intervention, the cub wouldn't survive another day in the desert heat. Mac made a decision that went against every safety protocol he had established. He unlocked the enclosure gate and stepped inside, moving slowly and keeping his voice calm. Kisi tensed, but didn't retreat, her eyes fixed on Mac's face as if trying to read his intentions. When he knelt beside her and gently lifted Tao, she whined softly but allowed it, a level of trust that spoke to the weeks of patient care Mac had provided during her recovery. Carrying Tao to his small veterinary clinic, Mac was acutely aware of Kisi limping behind them, her injured leg making each step deliberate but determined. She had never left her enclosure since arriving, yet now she followed, without hesitation, understanding somehow that her adopted cub needed help she couldn't provide. The clinic examination revealed the full extent of Tao's condition. The cub was severely malnourished, weighing barely 3 kilograms when he should have been closer to 5. Tick infestations covered his ears and neck, and several small wounds suggested encounters with thorns during his journey through the wilderness. Most concerning was his temperature, dangerously low despite the ambient heat, indicating his body was shutting down. Mac worked methodically, drawing on his medical training while Kisi watched from the clinic doorway. He started an IV drip, treated the tick bites, cleaned and dressed the wounds, and wrapped Tao in warming blankets. Throughout the process, the cub remained listless, barely responding to stimulation. Mac had seen this condition before in trauma patients. The body's surrender when survival seemed impossible. What happened next challenged every assumption Mac held about animal behavior. As he finished treating Tao, Kisi approached the examination table and began her own form of therapy. She licked the cub's face with gentle, rhythmic strokes, her rough tongue stimulating circulation and providing comfort. Her low, rumbling vocalizations weren't the aggressive sounds typically associated with hyenas, but something resembling a purr. Under Kisi's ministrations, Tao began to respond. His breathing deepened, his body temperature started to rise, and after an hour of this interspecies nursing, he opened his eyes and looked directly at his unlikely savior. The moment of recognition between them was unmistakable. Predator and prey transformed into surrogate mother and adopted child. The first major challenge came that afternoon when Dr. Naledi arrived for her weekly visit. Mac heard her vehicle approaching and felt his stomach tighten with anxiety. How could he explain what had happened without sounding completely insane? A hyena adopting a lion cub violated fundamental principles of wildlife biology. Sarah stepped out of her dusty Land Cruiser, expecting routine examinations and medication adjustments. Instead, she found Max sitting on his clinic floor with a lion cub sleeping in his lap, while an injured hyena rested protectively beside them both. Her initial reaction was exactly what Mac had feared, professional concern mixed with disbelief. "Mac, what in God's name is happening here?" Sarah's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions about wildlife management. "You know the protocols. Lion cubs belong with their pride or in specialized facilities. And having a hyena in close contact with any other species. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel." Mac explained the morning's events, watching Sarah's expression shift from skepticism to fascination as she observed the remarkable dynamic between Casey and Tao. When the cub woke and immediately sought comfort from the hyena, nuzzling against her spotted coat while she groomed his golden fur, Sarah fell silent. Professional protocol demanded they separate the animals immediately and contact wildlife authorities. Lions and hyenas were apex predators with complex territorial behaviors that made cohabitation impossible. Yet the evidence before them suggested that sometimes nature operated beyond human understanding. The real test came that evening when Mac attempted to feed Tao. Lion cubs required specialized nutrition, and hand-feeding wild animals carried risks for both caregiver and patient. Mac had prepared a mixture of milk formula and nutrients, but Tao showed little interest in the bottle, turning his head away and mewing weakly. Cassie intervened in a way that left both humans speechless. She gently took the bottle in her powerful jaws, careful not to puncture it, and offered it to Tao while making soft, encouraging sounds. The cub immediately began feeding, responding to his adoptive mother's presence in ways he hadn't for Mac alone. As night fell over the Kagalagadi, Mac faced the decision of where both animals should sleep. Separating them seemed cruel after witnessing their bond, but housing them together presented obvious risks. Cassie solved the dilemma by simply lying down in the clinic, positioning herself where she could watch both Tao and the doorway. Mac brought bedding and settled beside them, creating an unlikely family of healing creatures. As he listened to Tao's content purring and Cassie's gentle breathing, he realized that his understanding of animal behavior was being rewritten. This wasn't just unusual, it was revolutionary. The first night passed peacefully, but Mac knew the real challenges lay ahead. Word would spread about this impossible relationship, bringing attention from researchers, authorities, and skeptics who might not share his willingness to let nature take its own course. Word traveled fast in the sparse communities surrounding the Kagalagadi. By the third day, Mac's phone rang constantly, with calls from curious neighbors, concerned wildlife officials, and eventually, reporters who had somehow caught wind of the story. The first visitor was Johannes van der Merwe, a local rancher whose cattle operation bordered the rehabilitation center. Johannes arrived unannounced, his weathered face skeptical as he climbed out of his pickup truck. Mac had been expecting this visit. The ranching community was already on edge about predator activity, and news of a facility housing both lions and hyenas would inevitably raise concerns about livestock safety. "Mac, people are talking," Johannes said without preamble. "They say you've got dangerous animals living together like house pets. Some folks are worried about what might happen if they get out." Mac led Johannes to the observation area where Cassie and Tao could be seen through reinforced glass. The rancher's complaints died in his throat as he watched the hyena carefully grooming the young lion, her movements gentle and deliberate. Tao had grown stronger over the past few days, his golden coat regaining its luster and his playful personality beginning to emerge. What Johannes witnessed next would become one of the most talked about moments in local folklore. Tao, now energetic enough to explore, wandered too close to the fence where a ground squirrel had approached from outside. Instead of encouraging hunting behavior, Cassie immediately moved between the cub and the potential prey, gently but firmly guiding Tao away. She was actively teaching him not to hunt, behavior that contradicted every instinct a wild hyena should possess. Johannes removed his hat and scratched his graying head. "In 40 years of ranching, I've never seen anything like this. It's like she's forgotten what she is." The story reached Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a behavioral ecologist from the University of Cape Town, within the week. Unlike the local visitors who came out of curiosity or concern, Dr. Rodriguez arrived with cameras, recording equipment, and a team of graduate students. She had specialized in interspecies relationships for 15 years, but had never encountered anything remotely similar to what Mac described. "This challenges fundamental assumptions about predator behavior," Dr. Rodriguez explained as she set up observation equipment. "Adoption across species lines occurs occasionally, but never between apex predators who are natural competitors. If we can document this properly, it could revolutionize our understanding of animal cognition and social behavior." The research team's presence brought its own complications. Government wildlife officials, alerted by the academic attention, arrived demanding explanations and documentation. Captain Mamalaki Sarame from the Department of Wildlife represented the legal reality Mac had been dreading. Keeping wild lions required special permits, and the unusual circumstances didn't automatically exempt him from regulations. "Mr. Thompson, we appreciate your conservation work," Captain Sarame said during a tense meeting in Mac's kitchen, "but regulations exist for public safety. Lions are dangerous animals, regardless of their current behavior. We need assurances that proper protocols are being followed." Dr. Naledi advocated fiercely for Mac's position, providing veterinary documentation of both animals' health and behavior patterns. Her professional standing carried weight with the authorities, but Mac could see the conflict in Captain Sarame's eyes, caught between bureaucratic requirements and the extraordinary circumstances before him. The breakthrough came when Tao fell ill with a stomach infection common in hand-reared cubs. As Mac and Dr. Naledi worked to treat him, Kizzy's behavior provided the most compelling evidence yet of her maternal bond. She refused to eat, keeping constant vigil beside the weakened cub. When Tao's fever spiked dangerously high, Kizzy positioned herself to provide cooling contact, her body temperature naturally lower than the cub's. Dr. Rodriguez captured everything on camera, documenting behavior that contradicted decades of research on hyena psychology. "She's exhibiting maternal stress responses identical to those we see in biological mothers," she explained to the assembled officials. "Her cortisol levels are elevated, her feeding patterns disrupted. Neurologically, she has bonded with this cub as if it were her own offspring." The local community's attitude began shifting as word spread of Kizzy's dedication. Nomsa Kosana, who operated a small trading post 20 kilometers away, brought her grandchildren to witness what she called a miracle of the desert. Her grandson, Thabo, 8 years old and usually fearful of wild animals, stood mesmerized watching Kizzy teach Tao to play with a rubber ball. "Animals know things we've forgotten," Namsa told Mac as they watched the unlikely pair interact. "In the old stories, different creatures helped each other survive. Maybe they still remember what we lost." Media attention escalated when a documentary crew from Johannesburg arrived, led by filmmaker David Mogale, who specialized in African wildlife stories. Unlike the scientific observers, Mogale was interested in the human element, how Mac's own journey as a veteran dealing with loss had intersected with this remarkable animal relationship. The pressure mounted when regional wildlife authorities announced plans for a formal evaluation of the facility. Mac knew that one negative report could result in both animals being removed to separate locations, ending their extraordinary bond. The stakes had never been higher, and the window for proving that some relationships transcended natural law was rapidly closing. Local support crystallized around an unexpected source. Johannes van der Merwe organized neighboring ranchers to petition authorities on Mac's behalf. Men who typically viewed predators as threats to their livelihoods found themselves defending the right of a hyena and lion cub to remain together. 3 months later, the authorities granted Mac a special research permit, making the Kagalagadi Wildlife Haven the first facility officially authorized to study interspecies adoption between apex predators. Casey and Tao became the subjects of groundbreaking research that would influence wildlife conservation policies across Africa. As Tao grew stronger and larger, their bond only deepened. The young lion learned Casey's hunting techniques, social behaviors, and even her distinctive way of greeting Mac each morning. When Tao reached adolescence, he faced a choice: return to the wild to find his own pride, or remain with his adoptive mother. He chose Casey. The pair now roams a specially designed 100-acre enclosure, living as a family unit that shouldn't exist according to nature's rules. Tao, now fully grown at 180 kilograms, still seeks comfort from Casey during thunderstorms. She, despite her age and lingering injury, remains his constant companion and protector. Mac's facility became an international destination for researchers studying animal cognition and emotional intelligence. The man who once felt isolated by grief discovered that healing often comes from the most unexpected places. Casey and Tao taught him that love transcends every boundary, species, instinct, and expectation. Dr. Reeves' research team documented over 200 instances of cross-species nurturing behavior, proving that emotional bonds in the animal kingdom run far deeper than previously understood. Their findings challenged textbooks and inspired a new generation of conservationists. Today, 5 years later, Max still sits on his porch each evening, watching his impossible family play in the golden African sunset. Casey's limp has worsened with age, but her devotion to Tao remains absolute. Their story continues to inspire visitors from around the world, proving that sometimes the heart knows truths that science is still learning to understand. What did you think of this incredible true story? Have you ever witnessed an unlikely animal friendship that defied explanation? Share your experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming wildlife stories that prove love truly knows no boundaries. Hit that notification bell so you never miss these amazing tales of hope and healing.